Welcome to the Covered Bridges of New Hampshire podcast, where we discuss all things related to covered bridges in the Granite State. Here's your host, Kim Chandler.
Hello, Covered Bridge people, and welcome to the podcast. Today we're talking with Francis Faulkner Jr. of Swanzey about his involvement in fundraising efforts to rebuild the Slate Bridge after it was destroyed by arson in 1993. Francis shares the many layers of funding through the process of town meeting and the community connection to covered bridges in Swanzey. Here we go. Located in the southwest corner of New Hampshire, the town of Swanzey is home to four historic covered bridges. The Thompson Bridge, built in 1832, the Crescent Bridge, built in 1859, the Slate Bridge, built in 1862, and the Carlton Bridge, built in 1869. By the early 1990s, these covered bridges all seemed to reach their expiration date about the same time. As the town of Swanzey allocated funds through town warrants to repair their beloved bridges, a tragedy reduced one of them to ashes. In this episode, we're talking with longtime Swanzey resident and former town selectman Francis Faulkner Jr. about the town's efforts to restore the three remaining covered bridges and replace the fourth. Francis has a record of dedicated service to the town of Swanzey, including 11 years as a selectman, 10 years as a grounds and facilities maintenance supervisor, 23 years as a firefighter, and a past member of the zoning board. Francis worked for over 30 years at Kingsbury Corporation in various positions, from machinist to engineering to sales. Francis is currently a trustee of the First Congregational Church of Swanzey. Welcome to the podcast, Francis.
Thank you.
Before we get started, a lot of my questions are around town warrant articles and town meeting, and I'm wondering if you can explain to our non-New Englanders what a town meeting is.
A town meeting is where voters, registered voters of the town, get together to decide the affairs of the town. So the selectmen put together a warrant that, outlines what needs to be done in the next year, including police departments, fire departments, maintaining streets and roads. And all of that comes up for discussion, and people can either add money to it, take money away from it. So it's basically the townspeople are deciding their own fate, so to speak.
And they usually do that on a Saturday in the town hall.
Now it has to be, I think it's the second Tuesday of March.
Okay.
That's always the town meeting. And, everybody, it was a big deal. Mm-hmm. And I kind of miss it.
It's just a different type of government, and I'm actually kind of surprised that it still exists, but I think in this part of New Hampshire, it's never going away.
But there used to be, this was years ago, there used to be an article or a warrant question that would raise $50 to do pine blister rust control. And that $50 article, people would talk about it for half an hour because $50 was something they could understand.
Right. And I'm sorry you had to listen to old cassette tapes of town meetings. It must have been horrible.
Well, it's who we used to have as a moderator in town is your typical New Englander. I mean, he had the New England accent, and he added something to town meeting that you don't get today, with the SB2 ballot thing. Mm-hmm. There was a sense of humor. It was almost like a variety show going to town meeting.
Let's set the stage for the state of Swanzey's four covered bridges in the early 1990s. In 1988, the Carlton Bridge was closed due to safety concerns. And then 2 years later, the Thompson Bridge was also closed. And at town meeting in 1991, voters rejected a $500,000 warrant article to fix the Thompson Bridge, Why was that? Why did the voters say no to that?
At the 1991 town meeting, there was an article proposed to raise $500,000 to repair the Thompson Bridge. There were several estimates that were done by various engineering firms, and these estimates ranged from $250,000 to $500,000. The state of New Hampshire DOT was contacted, but they stated that they would not be involved in any of the repairs to the Thompson Bridge, as they didn't have that 80/20 bridge program in place at that time.
Okay.
And the Swanzey town moderator, who was also a representative for the state at the time, spoke with the DOT commissioner. And the commissioner basically told him that the state had no money to do any repairs on any bridges, and that the New Hampshire gas tax would need to be increased so as to be able to provide them with money to be able to do any kind of repairs. After considerable debate on Article 7 as to best how to take on the repairs needed for the Thompson Bridge, concerns included the ability for the emergency vehicles to use the bridge. And they were kind of told that even with the best repairs that could take place, it was only going to get a 6-ton weight limit.
Okay.
And typical fire trucks weigh in the neighborhood of 20-ton. So other individuals also expressed the amount of time required for emergency vehicles to drive around to the other bridge, which amounted to about 3 minutes. And then there were several individuals that suggested that the repairs be put off for 1 or 2 years, as they felt the money could be spent better elsewhere. Had the bond issue passed, it would have added 40 cents per $1,000 value.
The following year, voters changed their mind and they voted yes. So what was the difference? What shifted that, do you think?
In 1992, basically it was Article 5 that was being proposed. And I spoke during the meeting saying that the town would take out a construction loan. And then once the repairs were complete, they would know exactly how much money was needed. And at that time, they would go and take out a 10-year bond. There was a bridge committee in place that consisted of 8 members, and they did a look at all of the bridges in town and decided what needed to be done to them. But it was also stated that the Thompson Bridge was left by our forefathers, and it should be repaired in their honor to respect them. The bridge has social value as well as economic value and historic value to the town. The engineers that was present at the meeting stated that the repairs being done would be good for 50 to 60 years. And the tax impact for this article would only be 36 cents per $1,000, because the interest rates were a lot lower than they were the previous year. So the article did pass, 380 yes votes to 80 no votes.
I know work started the following year on the Thompson Bridge, and shortly before the bridge reopened, the Slate Bridge was destroyed. Can you tell us about the events of March 8th, 1993?
That was actually the day before the next town meeting in 1993. And during that meeting, a petition was started to make the state of New Hampshire aware that something needed to be done to replace the Slate Bridge and to find those responsible for destroying the bridge. So there was kind of an informal committee that was started, but it wasn't the official committee.
What was the community response to the loss of the Slate Bridge to arson?
There were a lot of heartbroken people that, you know, had seen that bridge there for a number of years. It also prevented individuals in Westport from easy access. There's a store at the end of the road, and they would have to drive all the way around to get to that store. Senator Blaisdell, who was state Senate president at the time, he put a tremendous amount of pressure on the DOT. And you had to be at some of those meetings to hear him, what he said to the DOT people. It was basically, if you can't do your job, I'll find somebody that can.
Wow. Wow. And where was he from? Was he from the area?
Yes, he was from Keene.
Okay.
There used to be a sporting goods store on Roxbury Street that he had.
Okay. So he had a personal interest in ensuring
Yes,
that
he
covered
did.
bridge came back. Yeah. Yeah. And I know there was discussion of installing a concrete and steel bridge and moving forward. And I know there was a lot of resistance to that.
Yes. They did put a Bailey Bridge in place, you know, after Senator Blaisdell kind of told the DOT where they were supposed to go. And that remained there until the actual construction started on the Slate Bridge. But the state was interested in doing a steel and concrete bridge, but the town didn't want to buy into that.
Right. Based on what you said earlier, that the state didn't have funding for bridges, do you think that's why that was their response, was to
Yes.
assist with a concrete and steel bridge? Yeah. And I know there were a lot of newspaper articles and press about there was an arrest for the arson, and that a young man stood trial and was found not guilty. What was the community response to that?
They weren't happy, but arson is one of those things that is very, very difficult to prove. I mean, you almost got to be standing there and seeing the individual light the match, you know, in order to get a conviction.
And I have a photo that the Swanzey Historical Society shared with me of the Slate Bridge totally engulfed in flames. And the story from that was the neighbor looked out, saw the front end of the bridge on fire, called the fire department, and came back, and the whole bridge was engulfed. It
Yes.
seems like it just went so fast. It's a really hard photo to see. I show it in my programs, and it makes me feel physically ill every time I look at it.
And when the bridge was, you know, had burnt and was sitting in the river, other individuals that really didn't live in town but owned property in town became involved. And one of those individuals was Dr. Timothy Johnson from ABC News.
Oh, right.
And he did a interview at the bridge, you know, encouraging it to be replaced.
A new covered bridge was finally proposed by the New Hampshire DOT for $1.4 million, with 80% of the funds coming from the state bridge aid program. And Swanzey had to come up with 20%, which was about $280,000. And again, voters said no to the Warren article. Can you talk about that?
The article that was proposed included $450,000. And the state had available in the 80-20 program $10 million, but it was on a first come, first served basis. So when when that article came up at town meeting, there was a lot of discussion about it. But the town submitted 3 other bridges at the same time. So the voters were confused as to, you know, which bridge was going to make the list. So that's more or less why they turned it down. And it got a majority vote. It was 339 yes to 227 no, But in order to meet the 2/3 majority, it needed to have 373 yes.
Okay.
Bond issues are very, very difficult to pass, especially in Swanzey.
Yeah. Right. Well, and I guess I go back to, Swansea is the only no, there is one other community in the state that has four covered bridges. Cornish is the other one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's expensive to
It
have
is.
four historic bridges. And I would guess that the votes were not people who were rejecting the idea of a covered bridge. They're just looking out for what their tax bill is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to have both, I would imagine,
Yes.
in such a small town. So after those two warrant articles failed in 1995, you became the chair of the Slate Covered Bridge Committee. Can you tell us about that and how that started?
It started because where I grew up was within about 100 yards of the bridge. So, I mean, I had spent my whole childhood looking at that bridge
Mhm.
and really, really wanted to get it put back there.
What was that committee like? How many people were on the committee? Did people volunteer?
There were people that volunteered. I think that the committee itself consisted of 8 to 10 people of different varying backgrounds. And we just all worked together to try to come up with the necessary funds to get the job done.
And I've done fundraising. It's it's hard work.
It is.
It feels like a lot of nickel and diming people for a big amount. And I know that your committee had a Slate Covered Bridge bicycle tour. You had a 5K road race. You had raffles and cocktail socials, chili cook-off, sold homemade pies, sold t-shirts, had a variety show. You sold mums. You had yard sales. I mean, every possible fundraiser I've ever heard of, you did, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of work for eight to 10
It
people.
is.
And it sounds like at the end of the day, at the end of 2 years, you had only raised $16,000. How was that? How did that feel to you?
It was kind of disheartening, but it kind of, made the committee say, we've got to look at another way of getting funds.
Mhm.
And that's when we approached the Kingsbury Fund and the Putnam Foundation to see if they would contribute, and they both did, substantial amount of money. And Yankee Magazine also became more involved with that subscription program where for every subscription the committee sold, they would add $10 to our fundraiser.
Mhm.
And they did all their advertising, they promoted it in their magazine. They had us go down to the Eastern States Fair and hold a booth down there and,
Mm.
do magazine subscription sales there. So they put a lot of time and effort into it.
How did they become involved? I know that Yankee's pretty local.
There was a lady that worked for them. Her name was Christine Salem. And she approached me one day about, seeing if we would be interested in, working with Yankee Magazine to try to help raise funds for the bridge.
That's amazing. And I imagine the reach from Yankee. I mean, they're a local magazine, but they have national reach.
Yes,
Yeah. And so do you feel like that really pushed the fundraising over the
it did,
top?
because it gave it, more meaning, to have two prominent companies in town, plus, a nationwide company promoting, putting this bridge back.
Hmm. And so when the funding was finally in place, I know that construction on the bridge began in 2000. And one other question I have is it sounds like the fundraising may have been pushed over the edge in 1997, 1998, that there was a 2-year delay between when the bridge started to be built. Do you know why that delay happened?
Primarily, it was due to we had to wait for another town meeting to, make sure we had the funds in place. and the town was going to take, because the committee didn't reach the entire goal, so the town was going to have to put money in from the capital reserve funds that were in place at the time to bring the total up to what we needed.
Mm-hmm.
And once that was done and the state accepted that we had the funds, then the bridge could go ahead and be designed and a contractor hired.
Okay. Were you part of that vetting process to hire Hoyle Tanner to work on the bridge, or was that through the state?
I don't believe I was, because I was not a selectman at the time.
Okay.
I had left office in '96 to focus on the fundraising effort.
So I know that construction began in 2000 and the bridge opened in 2001. And what was that like for you to see the Slate Bridge back
It
over the
was
river?
very, very moving, very moving. Because I went down almost every day when they were building the trusses, just to watch how they did it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the day that they started setting the trusses, you're talking of pieces of wood that are 143 feet long and 15 feet tall. And they had a huge crane down there that day, and they had one truss over the river, and the contractors wanted it moved like 6 more inches. And the crane operator says, "I am maxed out. You've got what you got."
Wow. So you went down every day to watch the
Yes,
bridge. Wow. Do you still live near the Slate Bridge?
I do.
Okay.
I'm probably 2.5 miles away.
Okay. How different is it from the bridge that you grew up next to?
It's a lot bigger, and it'll carry more weight than the original bridge. A lot of the covered bridges today have solid floors, that go from one side to the other.
Mm-hmm.
And the Slate Bridge used to have 3 plank runners on either side. So when you drove into the bridge, you had to, keep your wheels on those runners. And they did that because it was less expensive to repair. In other words, they could take up, 6 feet of boards as opposed to reflooring the whole bridge.
Okay. Is that an area that you could swim in and fish and things like that, or is the water not deep enough there?
Yeah, you could. I mean, today you could. I wouldn't, when I was growing up, the river water was not in the condition that it's in today.
Mm.
So it wouldn't have been something you wanted to swim in.
Mm-hmm.
Because there were a lot of woolen mills upstream that,
Mm-hmm.
Put a lot of chemicals into the water.
Right. Was the bridge something that did you play in the bridge when you were little? Did you climb around? Like, what was the bridge like? What did it mean to you?
I didn't, but I know, I had friends that did, that were, kind of like monkeys all over the bridge.
Well, and I know, and that kind of leads me to my question of, how covered bridges, how important they are to small communities. And it's not just, like you said, getting from here to there or not having to go around or being able to access places when you're traveling, but it also means something to community members to walk out of their house and look over and see that covered bridge or have it
Yes.
as a touchstone to your childhood. Can you talk about that, about what the covered bridges mean to the Swanzey community and to you?
I mean, not just the Slate Bridge, but all the covered bridges in town have a meaning to, a lot of the townspeople. There are some townspeople that would just as soon see, a conventional bridge as opposed to a covered bridge. But Swanzey is noted for its covered bridges. In fact, the town seal has a covered bridge as part of it.
Mm-hmm. It's a testament to people like you who not only had leadership positions in the town, but also left those leadership positions to take on probably next to a full-time volunteer job trying to raise money to keep these covered bridges. And I'm grateful for your efforts and the efforts of your committee to ensure that the covered bridges stay.
Thank you.
So do you have any closing thoughts or anything that you'd like to add?
I guess as a closing thought, that the original bridge stood for 131 years. The bridge that is there today has been there for 22 years, which is far short of the original bridge. But I think with the grace of God and good maintenance, that it will easily carry individuals for well into the future.
I agree. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today.
You're welcome.
Covered Bridges of New Hampshire is created by me and recorded in Hancock, New Hampshire. The song Old New Hampshire was arranged and performed by Josh Black. The introduction is courtesy of Greg Kretschmar. This podcast is a companion to my book, Covered Bridges of New Hampshire. You can find out more about the book, the podcast, blog posts, upcoming events, and an interactive covered bridge map at coveredbridgesnh.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Covered Bridges of New Hampshire. Please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Kim Chandler. Thanks for listening.